The morning they ran her out of Colorado City, the wind came off the Llano Estacado like a blade, flat, cold, and merciless. The kind of wind that doesn't howl so much as press itself against a person and refuse to let go. It was the autumn of 1883, and the high plains of West Texas had a way of revealing a person's true nature without asking permission. Her name was Nascha. It meant owl in the tongue of the Chiricahua Apache people, a name given to her by a grandmother who said that owls see what others cannot, that they watch in the dark so the living may rest. She was 24 years old, and she had walked the last 11 miles into Colorado City on feet wrapped in strips of torn wool blanket, because the horse she had borrowed from a mescalero man 2 days east had thrown a shoe near the dry creek bed, and she could not afford to lame it further. She arrived at the edge of town just as the general store was being unlocked for the morning. She was dressed in a dark cotton skirt and a calico blouse she had been given by a soldier's wife at Fort Concho 3 weeks prior, and she carried nothing but a small bundle of belongings tied in oilcloth. Her hair was black and long, worn in a single braid. Her face was angular and calm. Her eyes did not look away from people who stared, which made the staring worse. She had come to Colorado City because of a letter. Or rather, because of a letter that had been read to her. She could understand spoken English with some confidence, but written words still required a careful and willing translator. The letter had been written by a man named Harlan Moore, a dry goods merchant in Colorado City, and it had made its way to the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona Territory through a series of hands that included a reservation school teacher, a traveling preacher, and a Tonkawa scout who made regular runs between Fort Concho and the agency. Harlan Moore was looking for a wife. He was 41 years old, a widower with a good business and a decent house. He had, through the schoolteacher at San Carlos, made arrangements to marry a woman of the Apache people, a widow who had been highly recommended for her calm temperament, her skill with domestic work, and her knowledge of medicinal plants, knowledge that was genuinely valued in a place where the nearest doctor operated out of a converted barbershop and charged more than most people earned in a month. What Harlan Moore had not fully reckoned with was the opinion of Colorado City. He had perhaps underestimated the particular fury of a town that had recently seen Comanche raids to its south, Apache conflicts to its west, and newspaper editorials that described every Native American in West Texas in language that a decent person would not repeat in church. The editor of the Mitchell County Courier had only 6 months prior published a column arguing that the Army's Black Cavalry Regiment stationed at nearby Fort Concho, the men the Comanche had named Buffalo Soldiers, were, as he put it, unfit for the frontier. It was a town with a specific attitude about who belonged within its limits and who did not. When Nascha arrived and asked at the general store for the location of Harlan Moore's business, the young clerk behind the counter looked at her for a long moment and then told her Mr. Moore was not expecting company today. She said she had traveled 3 weeks from the San Carlos Reservation in the Arizona Territory. He said that was a far piece and he was sorry for her trouble, and could she please step back outside. By midday, a small and hostile crowd had gathered near the entrance of Moore's dry goods store. By the time Harlan Moore himself appeared, a thin, nervous man with apologetic eyes and a collar that seemed to be choking him, the decision had already been made by others on his behalf. There were men in that crowd who spoke to him in low voices, men who described what would happen to his business if he proceeded with what they called his arrangement. One of them was the town banker. One of them owned the warehouse where Moore stored his inventory. The third was simply a man with a wide chest and hard hands who didn't say much but whose presence said everything. Harlan Moore came out of his store and looked at Nascha with an expression she had seen before. Not hatred, not contempt, but something worse. Embarrassment. He said he was sorry. He said things had changed. He said he hoped she would understand. Then he went back inside and the door closed, and the lock turned with a sound that was quiet enough to be polite and loud enough to be final. She stood in the street for a moment. Then she turned and began walking west. There was no cruelty in her face, no tears. She had learned, by 24 years of living in two worlds that were each equally convinced she belonged to neither, that the face you show to people who have wronged you must cost them nothing. It must give them nothing to take. She walked west because west was the only direction left, and because the Llano Estacado spread out in that direction like a burned page, vast and copper-colored in the October light. And she knew that land better than any of the men who had just closed their doors against her. Daniel Webster Wallace had been riding since before dawn. He had learned this habit in his years working cattle drives. The hours before sunrise were the most honest hours of the day, the ones when the land told you the truth about itself. He was 23 years old that autumn, though he carried himself like a man of 40 who had made peace with most things and was still working on the rest. He had been born into slavery in Victoria County, Texas, in September of 1860, 3 months after his mother had been sold to a family called the O'Daniels. Sold while carrying him, which was a thing he had known all his life and had turned over in his mind like a stone, until he understood that bitterness about it would cost him more than it would cost anyone else. So he had set it down, not forgotten it. Set it down. He had run away from the O'Daniel farm at 15, slipped out before the roosters had opinion about it, and joined a cattle drive headed north. He had worked for C.C. Slaughter and for a rancher named Sam Golson, who ran cattle west of the Concho River. He had worked for Clay Mann on the Great Man's Spread in Mitchell County, and it was Mann who had given him something rarer than wages: respect and a plan. Mann's cattle brand was a large numeral 80 burned into the right hip of every head he owned, and his cowboys were known across the panhandle as Mann's men. Because Daniel worked Mann's cattle most of his days, the range named him 80 John, a name that stuck the way honest names do, because it fit. Mann had told him, "Take half your wages in cattle. Save the land money. The range won't always be open. When it closes, you want to be standing on your own side of the fence." Daniel had listened. He had taught himself to read and write by riding 40 miles north to Navarro County and spending his off-season Sundays at a schoolhouse that had agreed, after considerable persuasion, to allow him to sit in the back row. He was not a man who waited to be invited. By 1883, he had saved enough to purchase a small parcel of land southeast of Lorain in Mitchell County. 1,280 acres of rocky, stubborn West Texas earth, and had begun building what he intended to be something that would outlast him. He ran a modest herd, kept good horses, and hired 2 men to help him: a lean and quiet Tejano named Eusebio, who had been working cattle since before the Civil War ended, and a young freedman from East Texas named Willis, who could fix almost anything with wire and patience. He was riding the eastern fence line that morning when he saw her. She was a half-mile south of his property, walking along the old Butterfield stage road that had once carried mail between San Antonio and El Paso before the war interrupted everything. She was walking west, carrying a bundle, and walking with the particular steadiness of someone who had already decided not to stop no matter what happened. The sky behind her was the color of a bruise healing toward yellow. The wind was picking up. He rode to the fence line and sat his horse and watched her for a moment. A man alone on the plains could read trouble from a distance, and he had learned to be still before he acted. She was not in distress in the way of someone injured. She was in distress in the way of someone who had nowhere to go and was walking anyway, which is its own kind of emergency. He called out. She stopped and turned. He asked if she needed water. She said she had some. He asked where she was headed. She looked at him for a moment, taking his measure the same way he was taking hers. With careful and unhurried eyes, she said she was not entirely sure. He said that was an honest answer. He dismounted, and they spoke across the fence in the morning cold, and she told him, without embellishment or apology, what had happened in Colorado City. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like distant applause. He said, "There is a line shack on the south end of my property that is not being used. It has a stove and firewood, and it is out of the wind. You are welcome to it for as long as you need." She looked at him with those careful eyes. She asked why. He said, "Because it is cold, and you are on foot, and there is no one else offering." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have skills. I do not take charity." He said, "I have 40 head that need doctoring for screwworm, and my regular hand is down with fever. If you know anything about livestock medicine, we can call it a fair trade." She knew a great deal about livestock medicine. The Chiricahua Apache had been managing horses and goats and the trade of animals across 3 territories for generations. And Nascha had learned from an uncle who was considered among the most knowledgeable men on the San Carlos reservation when it came to the ailments of animals. She also knew the uses of creosote bush and ocotillo root and yucca in ways that most frontier doctors would have found extraordinary, and most frontier townspeople would have found suspicious. She opened the fence gate and walked through. The line shack was modest but solid. Daniel Wallace built things to last, which was a lesson learned from men who had spent their lives building things for other people and understood the difference between work done for wages and work done for permanence. There was a small cast iron stove, a rope bed with a mattress of corn shuck, a table, and 2 chairs. A window faced south toward the Concho River Basin, and in the afternoon light, the view was amber and enormous. She spent the first 2 days doing little but sleeping and eating. The 3 weeks of travel had cost her more than she had acknowledged while walking. On the 3rd day, she rose before Daniel and went out to the south pasture and began examining the ailing cattle with the same precise attention she might give a difficult text. She did not hurry. She had been taught by the same grandmother who named her that rushing a sick animal was how you lost it. Daniel watched from the fence rail and said nothing. He had hired enough men to know the difference between someone who knew what they were doing and someone who was performing knowledge. She knew what she was doing. She treated the screwworm cases with a mix of pine tar and kerosene applied with a rolled cloth, a method she had seen used by Mexican vaqueros at the agency who traded with her people and had picked up the technique from ranchers in Sonora. Within a week, the infected cattle had begun to improve. Willis, who had spent 3 days trying to treat the same animals with limited success, watched her work with an expression that moved from skepticism to respect without stopping anywhere in between. In the evenings, she and Daniel sometimes sat on the narrow porch of the main house and spoke. He told her about his early years on the drives, the long nights with the cattle lowing and the stars enormous over the staked plains. She told him about San Carlos, not the version in the newspapers, which described it as a managed and peaceful solution to the Apache situation, but the reality. 5,000 people of multiple different and sometimes rival bands crowded onto land that could not support them, in a heat that reached 110 degrees in summer, with rations that arrived late or short or both, presided over by agents who ranged from indifferent to corrupt. She said this with outrage. The way you describe a river's course, not because you aren't moved by it, but because rage is a luxury you cannot afford when you are also trying to survive. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely. He asked how she had come to agree to the arrangement with the merchant in Colorado City. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because the alternative was to return to San Carlos, and I had watched everyone I loved die there. My husband died of typhoid in the summer of 1881. My sister 2 months after. There was a cousin who survived, but she had gone to live with her husband's people near the Gila River." She paused. I thought, perhaps a different life. Perhaps a man who sees a use for what I know, even if he does not see me. Daniel said,
Do you really think so?
"The man in Colorado City was a coward." She looked at him. She said, "Most men are, when their neighbors are watching." He agreed that this was largely true. The trouble came from Colorado City, as he had known it would. It arrived in the form of 3 men on horseback on a Thursday morning in November. When the first real cold had come down off the caprock and turned the water in the stock tanks to a thin skin of ice at the edges, their leader was a man named Chester Pruitt, who owned a large spread to the east and who served on the Mitchell County Stock Committee. A man whose opinion of himself had been polished to a high shine by a life that had mostly agreed with him. The second man was a deputy sheriff named Hicks, who had the look of someone accustomed to doing other people's unpleasant work. The third was simply large, which seemed to be his primary qualification. They rode up to the main house and Chester Pruitt called out from his horse without dismounting, which was how men announced their disrespect in that country. He said that he had heard that Daniel was harboring an Apache woman on his property and that the town had some concerns. Daniel came out of the barn with a bridle in his hand and looked at the three men without particular urgency. He said, "Good morning to you all." He did not invite them to step down. Pruitt said the woman needed to go back where she came from. He said the people of Colorado City were not comfortable with an Apache in the county. He said that given the recent troubles in Arizona territory, the papers were full of Geronimo in those years. Every Apache raid in the Southwest, amplified into catastrophe by telegraph and newspapers. Reasonable people had reasonable concerns. Daniel said, "She is on my property, and she is doing legitimate work." Pruitt said, "She is not a hired hand, Daniel. Everyone can see what she is." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He set the bridle over the fence post, slowly. The way you set something down when you want your hands free, but you want the gesture to be visible. He said, "She is a woman who was turned out in the cold by a man who lacked the backbone to honor his own arrangements. She is staying until she has somewhere better to go." That is the end of the discussion. Pruitt's face reddened in the cold air. He said, "You're a respected man around here, Daniel. People like you don't spend that goodwill on an Apache squaw." The word landed in the air between them. Daniel let it sit there for a moment so everyone present could see exactly what it was. Then he said, very quietly, "You will not use that word on my property again." Pruitt looked at him for a long beat. Then he looked at the deputy, and then at the large man. None of them moved. The High Plains wine moved through the dry grass and said nothing helpful. Pruitt turned his horse, and the three of them rode back toward Colorado City, and Daniel watched them go until they were small against the flat horizon. He turned back to the barn and picked up the bridle. His hands were steady. In the weeks that followed, the weight of Colorado City's opinion arrived in smaller and less visible ways. A merchant who had been supplying Daniel with feed grain on credit sent a letter saying the terms of the arrangement had changed. Two ranchers who had agreed to share a waterhole on the eastern boundary of his property suddenly found reasons to revisit that agreement. The man who ran the telegraph office in town, when Daniel went to send a wire to a cattle buyer in Abilene, seemed to lose the message and couldn't account for it. Daniel had been navigating this kind of country since he was 15 years old. He had learned to work around it the way water works around stone, not by force, but by patience and the willingness to find a different route. He went around the feed merchant and arranged supply through a man in Big Spring. The waterhole issue he solved by contracting Eusebio to extend the east windmill and deepen the secondary tank on his own property. The telegraph he handled by riding to Abilene himself. It cost him time and money. It cost him neither his dignity nor his resolve. Nascha saw all of this. She said very little about it, but she began, quietly, to take on more of the ranch work. Not because she had been asked, but because she understood that when someone is fighting on two fronts, the least you can do is hold one of them steady. She learned the particular habits of his cattle herd, which animals were dominant, which were nervous near the fence line, which had a tendency to drift south when the grass got thin. She learned that Willis hummed when he was working and went silent when something was wrong, and that Eusebio took his coffee without sugar and had strong opinions about the proper way to string a fence. She began, one morning, to repair the line shack properly. The door hung crooked and the chinking between the logs had dried and crumbled in sections. She worked with a calm efficiency that reminded Daniel of the way his mother had described certain women of her own experience. Women who did not need to explain their value because it was evident in everything they touched. He did not say this to her directly. A man who speaks too much about what he admires tends to make the thing he admires self-conscious. But one evening he asked her, in a straightforward way, what she intended to do next, where she thought she might go when the work was finished and the weather lifted. She said she had been thinking about that. She said she had no family left at San Carlos. She had a cousin near the Gila River, but that was a long way and a difficult road. She said the world was not organized in a way that made it easy for a woman of the Chiricahua Apache to simply decide her own course. She said this not with self-pity, but with the precision of someone naming an obstacle rather than lamenting it. He said, "You could stay." She looked at him. He said, "Not out of charity. I want to be clear about that. This land is going to need someone who understands it the way you do. The plants, the weather, the livestock. Eusebio is getting older. Willis wants to go back east eventually. I have been thinking about what kind of ranch I want to build here, and it occurs to me that I have been thinking about it as a solitary enterprise." He paused. That may have been short-sighted. She was quiet for a long time. The fire in the stove made the only sound, a low and patient crackling. She said, "You are not asking me to cook and keep house." He said, "I have managed my own cooking for 8 years. What I am asking is considerably more complicated than that." She said, "I will think about it." He said, "That is fair." Perhaps this is a good moment to pause and say something about what is easy to miss in stories like this one. We tend to remember the frontier as a story about land, who conquered it, who survived it, who built fortunes on it. But the more truthful story is about people who were considered worthless by the machinery of their time and who refused, quietly and persistently, to agree. Daniel Webster Wallace had been born into bondage. The men who owned the towns and the warehouses and the banks of Mitchell County had constructed an entire world designed to ensure that a man like him would remain permanently beneath them. And yet, here he stood on 1,280 acres of his own land, with cattle that bore his brand, and a name that people recognized for hundreds of miles in every direction, not because the world had been generous to him, but because he had been more patient and more determined than the world expected. And Nascha, the Apache widow who had walked 11 miles into Colorado City on wrapped feet and been turned away by a coward before noon, she had not arrived at that door weak. She had arrived carrying 24 years of survival in a body that had been expected to disappear quietly into a reservation and be grateful for the arrangement. Some people ask why stories like this still matter. Perhaps that is why. If these forgotten lives speak to you, the ones who were told they had no place and built one anyway, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys across the American frontier. There are more of these stories than history has been willing to tell. The event that changed everything in Colorado City happened in late November, and it had nothing to do with Daniel Wallace or Nascha directly. It happened to a man named Roy Calvert, who ran a small farm 4 miles south of town, and who was, on a Wednesday afternoon, attempting to clear a brush fire that had gotten away from him in the dry November wind. The fire jumped the creek and moved toward his barn and his 2 horses and the small winter hay supply that represented most of his financial security going into the next year. 3 of his neighbors came to help. They were not enough. It was Eusebio who saw the smoke first and rode back to the Wallace Ranch to report it. Daniel looked at the smoke column rising brown and angry against the blue sky and told Willis to get every available bucket. He rode south himself, fast, and arrived at the Calvert place ahead of most of the town volunteers. Nascha had not been asked. She came anyway. She knew fire. The Chiricahua Apache had been managing fire across the desert southwest for generations. Controlled burns, fire breaks, the reading of wind direction and grass moisture that could mean the difference between a managed blaze and a catastrophe. She arrived at the Calvert fire and within 2 minutes had assessed the wind and the terrain and the rate at which the fire was moving, and said clearly and without waiting for permission that they needed to pull all efforts away from the northwest corner of the barn, that it was already lost, and put everything they had on the southeast pasture fence line, because if the fire cleared that fence, it would take the Calvert winter grass and 3 more farms before nightfall. Several men looked at her. One started to object. Daniel said, "She's right. Move." They moved. The southeast fence line held. The barn's northwest corner was lost, but the barn itself, the horses, and the hay were saved. Roy Calvert stood in the smoldering field afterward, black-faced and breathing hard, and looked at Nascha the way a man looks at something he cannot entirely fit into what he thought he knew. He asked her how she had known where to put the brake. She said, "I watched where the grass was lowest and which way the smoke was bending in the crosswind." She paused. "My people have known this country's fire for a long time." He was quiet for a moment. Then he took off his hat and held it against his chest, the old gesture of genuine respect. He said, "Ma'am." It was a small word. It was an enormous word. The Mitchell County Courier did not write about Nascha's role in saving the Calvert farm. Some things the newspapers of that era chose not to see, but the people who had been there, Roy Calvert, his wife, the 2 neighboring farmers, the 4 volunteers from town who had been standing in the wrong place until she redirected them. Those people talked. In the way of small communities in the 19th century, the story moved from porch to porch and dinner table to dinner table, faster than the editor's opinion could contain it. Chester Pruitt heard about it within 3 days. He said nothing publicly. A man of Pruitt's type does not change his mind loudly. He simply adjusts his volume. He did not stop distrusting Nascha or what she represented to his understanding of how the world should be arranged. But he stopped sending men to Daniel's property with messages, and he stopped leaning on the supply merchants. And when Daniel nodded to him in passing on the main street of Colorado City 2 weeks later, Pruitt nodded back. It was not friendship, it was not even decency, but it was the absence of open warfare, and on the frontier that counted for something. The banker who had spoken to Harland Moore on the morning Nascha arrived, the same man whose opinion had closed the door of the dry goods store, came to Daniel in December with a proposal to purchase the eastern section of his grazing land for what he described as a fair price. Daniel listened to the offer with polite attention and declined, and the banker left looking surprised, which told Daniel everything he needed to know about whether the offer had been meant as a peace gesture or an opportunity. He told no one about the offer. He told no one about the decline. A man who broadcasts his victories tends to create his next battle. Nascha made her decision on a Sunday in December, the day after a brief but serious snowstorm had come off the Caprock and left the high plains silent and white and perfectly still. She found Daniel in the barn, doing what men do in the aftermath of a storm, checking on the animals, repairing small damages, taking inventory of what the cold had cost. She said, "I have decided to accept your arrangement." He looked up from the fence post he was examining. He said, "The conditions I proposed, they stand as I stated them. This is a partnership in the enterprise of this ranch. I am proposing a common law arrangement because I think a justice of the peace in Colorado City would not be our friend in this matter." She said, "I have conditions of my own." He said, "I would expect nothing less." She said, "I will not be asked to be someone other than who I am. My knowledge, my language, my customs, these are not embarrassments to be hidden on days when company comes." He said, "Agreed." She said, "If this land is shared, the decisions about it are shared." He said, "I designed it that way." She said, "And if there are people who come to this ranch needing help, Apache, Freedman, Mexican, any person who has been turned away somewhere else, they will not be turned away here." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved in their stalls. The snow on the roof made a settling sound. He said, "That is the kind of ranch I have been trying to build from the beginning." It just needed someone to say it out loud. She looked at him steadily. She said, "Then we are agreed." They shook hands, standing in the barn in the December cold, which was perhaps not the romantic conclusion that people in that era expected from such arrangements. But it was honest, and lasting things are built on honest foundations. What happened in the years that followed was not a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was history. Daniel Webster Wallace went on to become, as the Texas State Historical Association and the records of the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association would document, one of the most respected black ranchers in the history of West Texas. He did, in fact, purchase more land over the following years, growing his holdings beyond the original 1,280 acres. He became a member of the Cattle Raisers Association and attended their meetings, sometimes riding the segregated train to Fort Worth, which was itself a statement of composed defiance. To show up, to sit at the table of the powerful, and to behave as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He bought more Hereford cattle and Durham cattle and branded them with his own marks and turned them into money, and turned that money into more land and more cattle until his estate, by the end of his life, was worth more than $1 million. He never accepted charity. He never accepted defeat as a permanent condition. The ranch southeast of Lorain became known in the county for several things that did not appear in newspapers, but were understood by everyone who worked the land in Mitchell County. It was known as a place where a man who needed work could get it, regardless of what he looked like or where he was from. It was known as a place where the livestock was always in good condition, because the woman who managed the medical needs of the herd had knowledge that most frontier veterinarians spent their careers trying to approximate. It was known as a place where the kitchen was generous, and the door was not locked against travelers who had nowhere else to go. Nascha built, over those years, a particular kind of authority. Not political authority, not social authority in the sense that Colorado City would have recognized, but the authority that comes from being consistently and demonstrably right about the things that matter. She extended the windmill system on the south pasture using a design she had modified from one she had observed at the San Carlos agency. She cultivated a garden of medicinal plants along the creek line that served not only the ranch, but several neighboring farms whose inhabitants gradually overcame their suspicion of the source and began appearing at the gate with their ailments. She learned to read English, taught by Daniel in the evenings by lamplight, with the same patient precision with which he had taught himself, understanding that knowledge is the one thing that cannot be taken by a banker or a Frost. Not everyone in Colorado City came to respect them. Some people carried their opinions to their graves with perfect loyalty. Chester Pruitt was not, in the end, a changed man. He was merely a cautious one, which, in the practical economy of daily life, amounted to nearly the same thing. The editor of the Mitchell County Courier continued to write his editorials with characteristic blindness to the lives being lived south of the town limits. But the people who worked the land alongside them, the small farmers, the Tejano cowboys, the freedmen homesteaders who were attempting the same improbable thing that Daniel was attempting, those people knew what they were looking at. They saw a man who had been born into slavery and had built something real and lasting and entirely his own. They saw a woman who had been turned away from a door in the cold and had found something better than the door had been offering. They saw what it looked like when two people who had been told they were worth nothing proved, methodically and without fanfare, that they were wrong. Roy Calvert, who had stood in his smoke-blackened field with his hat against his chest, came to the Wallace Ranch the following spring with a cutting of grapevines he had ordered from a nursery in San Antonio. He said he had been told by a man who knew about such things that the soil along the creek would support a grape arbor if it was properly tended. He said he thought it might be useful. He set the cuttings on the porch and tipped his hat and rode away. The grape arbor grew. It took 3 years to produce fruit. The way things worth having tend to take longer than you'd wish. When it did, Nascha brought the first harvest inside and set it on the table. And Daniel looked at it for a moment, and then at her. and the expression on his face was one that required no translation in any language. The Butterfield Stage Road where Daniel had first seen Nascha walking west on a cold October morning was, by 1885, being slowly erased by new roads and a railroad spur that was creeping across the county. Progress has a way of covering over the paths that desperate people walked before it arrived. But in the oral tradition of the freedmen communities of Mitchell County and the ranching families of the Concho River Basin, the story of the Wallace Ranch and the Apache woman who helped build it persisted in the way that true stories do. Not in documents and official records, but in the telling, passed across dinner tables and front porches and campfires by people who understood that some things deserve to be remembered. Daniel Webster Wallace was inducted into the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum's Hall of Great Westerners in 2023, more than 80 years after his death. His original ranch house, built around 1890 in Mitchell County, was donated by his descendants to the Texas Tech National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, where it has been restored and stands today as a testament to what one man built from nothing on the stubborn, unforgiving earth of the Llano Estacado. The history books do not say very much about Nascha. The history of the American frontier is full of women whose names were not written down by people who thought names like theirs were worth writing. But the grape arbor grew. The ranch endured. The door, on the Wallace property southeast of Lorain, was never locked against travelers who had nowhere else to go. Perhaps the truest frontiers were never the ones on the maps. They were the distances between what the world decided you were worth and what you quietly, persistently proved. Some scars are not wounds. They are evidence. Evidence that something difficult came, and you met it. And you are still here. The woman who walked 11 miles on wrapped feet and was turned away before noon and kept walking anyway. She knew this. The man who was born into bondage and built an empire from patience and conviction. He knew it too. They found each other, as people sometimes do, at the exact moment when the world had done its worst and failed. Perhaps that is the part worth remembering. If this story found its way to something real in you, something you recognize from your own life or someone else's, tell us about it in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what part of this journey stayed with you, and if you want more stories of forgotten people who refuse to be forgotten, more of the real, unpolished, improbable history of the American frontier, subscribe and stay with us. There are more of these stories than you've been told. There always are. Historical note: Daniel Webster. 80 John Wallace was a real historical figure. Born September 15, 1860, in Victoria County, Texas. He became one of the most successful black ranchers in the history of West Texas, accumulating 1,180 acres of land near Lorain in Mitchell County, joining the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, and leaving an estate valued at over $1 million at his death in 1939. His ranch house is preserved at the Texas Tech National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. Colorado City, Texas, served as the seat of Mitchell County and was a real cattle town of the era. The San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation in Arizona Territory, the social conditions described there, the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th Cavalry at Fort Concho, the prejudice against them in the regional press, and the historical context of Apache displacement in the 1880s are all documented historical facts. Nascha and the events depicted in this story are fictional, created in the spirit of the lives that were lived but not recorded in the official histories of the American West.